One destroyed an inhabited planet, the other eradicated an entire race. One's mind was so fractured that she had to develop a secondary persona just to survive. These aren't stories of villains, these are stories of some of Marvel's most powerful women, and what happens when a universe decides that powers like theirs is a problem. Today, we're taking a look at the trope that Marvel keeps returning to. The trope that is the idea of when a woman holds too much power, something has to break, whether it's her mind, her morality, or the world around her. Today, we're going to be looking at Jean Grey, Sue Storm, and Wanda Maximoff, also known as the Scarlet Witch, and asking a question that Marvel rarely stops long enough to answer. Why does immense power always seem to come at a cost, at a woman's expense, or a woman's identity? Introduced all the way in X-Men #1 back in 1963, Jean Grey, also known as Marvel Girl, was the sole woman on the original X-Men roster. From the jump, she was powerful, but she was also consistently positioned as the most restrained member of the group, the heart, and the one who held back the most. Then came Uncanny X-Men #101, the issue that changed everything. Written by Chris Claremont and drawn by Dave Crockham, this issue is the issue where Jean Grey merges with the Phoenix Force while piloting a damaged shuttle through a solar flare, ultimately sacrificing herself to save the team. She emerges from Jamaica Bay, reborn, declaring herself as Phoenix, and for a moment it feels like a triumph. And a triumph it was indeed. In fact, in Uncanny X-Men #108, Phoenix single-handedly repairs the damaged M'Kraan crystal, a cosmic artifact that, if shattered, will destroy all of reality. She holds the universe together with her bare hands, and she's no longer a supporting character, she's virtually a god. But Marvel couldn't just let that stand. In fact, by Uncanny X-Men 129, the Marvel team began the Dark Phoenix Saga, which is widely considered one of the greatest comic book arcs ever written. Within the Dark Phoenix Saga, Emma Frost and the Hellfire Club manipulate Jean psychologically, fracturing her sense of self and unleashing the Dark Phoenix. And here's a crucial thing, Jean doesn't just snap, she's deliberately broken by outside forces. Her mind is invaded, her identity is dismantled, and the corruption isn't organic, it's engineered by outside forces. And yet the story treats her results as a failure of self. And by Uncanny X-Men 135, the Dark Phoenix consumes the Debari star system, an inhabited planet of billions, simply because she was hungry for energy. And in the following issue, the X-Men fight her on the moon in a battle that ends with Jean, in a moment of clarity, taking control of a weapon and ending her own life. Professor Xavier utilizes her, the team warns, and Jean, Marvel's first, arguably most powerful female, the X-Men, is defined for decades by that death alone. It's worth noting that Chris Claremont's original ending had Jean survive and be depowered as punishment. However, it was Jim Shooter, the then editor-in-chief, who insisted that she died, because in his view, she had committed genocide and couldn't simply just walk away. That intent was moral consequence. But the result was a blueprint that Marvel continues to return to time and time again. The powerful woman cannot be saved, only stopped. And then there's the resurrection. Jean has come back many times in Marvel Comics. She first comes back in X-Factor #1 back in 1986, but even that was complicated. Marvel retconned the Dark Phoenix as a separate entity that had replaced Jean while she slept in a healing cocoon at the bottom of Jamaica Bay. The idea was to restore Jean's innocence, but it actually did the exact opposite, and it was practically splitting her identity into two, the pure Jean and the dangerous cosmic force that wore her face. Later in Grant Morrison's new X-Men run, specifically Planet X, Magneto goes on a catastrophic rampage and Jean dies again, this time unlocking the full white phoenix of the crown before passing. Morris' run tried to honor Jean's power, but even then her greatest moment in ascension to who she is comes by her dying. The Phoenix Saga is brilliant, but its pattern is undeniable. Jean comes back, she dies. Now, Sue Storm's story plays out a little bit different, and in some ways more quietly devastating. Sue, of course, debuted in Fantastic Four #1 back in 1961, again by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And from the start, her powers felt like a metaphor. She turned invisible, creates force fields, whereas Reed stretches, Johnny burns, and Ben smashes. Sue hides and protects. Her abilities were literally built around being unseen. For years, writers didn't push much further than that. Sue was defined by her relationships, Reed's wife, Franklin's mother, the emotional core of the team. Her invisibility felt less like a superpower, more like a narrative role. It wasn't until Fantastic Four #22 in 1989 that writers seriously began exploring what Sue's powers could actually do. The realization that she could project force fields inside objects, and by extension inside somebody's body, suddenly she became one of the most quietly terrifying characters in Marvel. And it wasn't until Mark Waid's legendary Fantastic Four run in the early 2000s that pushed this narrative a little bit further. Waid's Sue was more confident, assertive, and deeply aware of her own power in a way that earlier versions were not. In the authoritative action arc, Fantastic Four 503 to 508, Sue accompanies the team to Doom's Latveria, and she's absolutely vicious, dismantling enemies with surgical precision, using her force fields in ways that generally are unsettling. Reed even commented that she may be the most dangerous member of the team. But it wasn't until later where the full scope of Sue's potential is acknowledged and immediately framed as terrifying. The idea that she could place a force field inside somebody's brain or expand one within every living organism simultaneously is treated as a nightmare scenario rather than the marvel of capability. Jonathan Hickman's run gave Sue some of her best material yet. She's a leader, she's a strategist, and fiercely protective of her family across multiple timelines and realities. But when Hickman, who did more for Sue's agency than any other writer before him, largely framed her power through the lens that she would rather protect than unleash, it opens a different perspective of who Sue can be. Going all the way back to 1996, where the entire Fantastic Four during the Heroes Reborn saga, Sue is characterized as regressed dramatically. She was softer, more passive, more dependent, and it was widely criticized by fans and served as a reminder of how easily Sue's development could be rolled back into just the mom role. But touching alternate realities in the Ultimate Universe, Sue is younger, but she's also largely defined by her relationship with Reed. Her powers are present, but it rarely is given the same weight as the male counterparts that she has around her. Sue's tragedy isn't defined by the dramatic cosmic meltdown. It's more subtler than that. It's decades of being the most powerful person in the room and being written as if she isn't. And on the rare occasion her power is truly acknowledged, the narrative treats it like a warning sign rather than a celebration. Wanda Maximoff debuted as a villain in X-Men #4 in 1964, a member of Magneto's Brotherhood of Evil Mutants alongside her brother Pietro. Her powers were vaguely defined as hex bolts, probability manipulation that caused bad luck and chaos. Even from the beginning, her abilities were treated as unpredictable and uncontrollable. She joined the Avengers in Avengers #16 and slowly became one of the team's most essential members. In Steve Englehart's Avengers run in the 1970s, it was a very transformative period for Wanda. Not only did he introduce her romance with Vision, he also explored her Romani heritage and started pushing her powers beyond simple hex bolts into something approaching actual magic. It was Englehart who first suggested that Wanda wasn't just a mutant, that she was a nexus being, a living focal point for magic energy. Then in 1985, Wanda and Vision had their own miniseries where Wanda and Vision get married, settle in the suburbs, and Wanda uses her power to will her children into existence, twin boys, Thomas and William. It should have been Marvel's happiest story. Instead, it planted the seeds of one of the most tragic moments in Marvel history. Wanda and Vision joined the West Coast Avengers. Vision is dismantled by a secret government task force and rebuilt without his emotions. Agatha Harkness, Wanda's mentor, reveals that her twins were never real and that they were fragments of the souls of Mephisto, the Marvel demon subconsciously drawn into Wanda's construct. Agatha then wipes Wanda's memory of her children entirely, believing it was a mercy. Wanda's grief was not allowed to fester. It was buried inside of her by someone she trusted. This was a wound that never healed, and this is something that Marvel would return to years later. In Avengers Disassembled, Wanda's repressed memories resurface catastrophically. She attacks the Avengers mansion, she kills Scott Lang by faking a resurrection of Jack of Hearts, she crashes a Quinjet into the mansion, Vision, her ex-husband, is torn apart by She-Hulk, Hawkeye dies in an explosion, and the team is decimated. And what was the response of the Avengers? They didn't grieve for her, they debated on whether to kill her because she was too powerful. Doctor Strange puts her in a catastrophic state. Magneto, her father, takes her to Genosha. In the story, one of the most devastating in Avengers history ends without healing, but with removal and exile. Then comes House of M, the most noted story in Marvel history. The 2005 event that would catapult Wanda out of the hero status sees Professor Xavier and the Avengers gather to decide Wanda's fate. Pietro, terrified for his sister, convinces her to rewrite reality. So what does she do? She creates a world where mutants rule, Magneto is king, and her children are alive and well. When the illusion collapsed, triggered by Lila Miller restoring people's memories, Wanda finally sees the chaos she caused. The grief and the rage converge into three spoken words that will haunt the mutant population forever. In an instant, the mutant population drops from millions to 189 known survivors. It's called M-Day, and it reshapes the entire X-Men line for years. Afterwards, entire runs were built off of this fallout from those three words, and what's devastating is that Wanda's breakdown was engineered. Agatha buried her grief, Pietro manipulated her into House of M, the Avengers abandoned her to Magneto rather than giving her help. She's basically a woman failed by the system around her and then blamed for the explosion that was a cause for her grief and her manipulation. Now, Bendis would later try to attempt a redemption arc for Wanda. In Avengers: The Children's Crusade, Wanda returns, restored her memories, and speaks the words "No more Avengers" to undo her early declaration, but the damage is done. Her legacy in comics is inseparable from M-Day. And this is something that we see in media outside of comics. The MCU leans hard into this framework. WandaVision pulls heavily from Tom King's Visions comic series and threads of House of M and shows Wanda constructing an entirely false narrative around her grief. And Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness takes a Darkhold, Marvel's most corruptive magical tech, and uses it as a means to fully transform Wanda into a villain, essentially completing the same arc that the comics did, but in 2 films instead of 40 years. In both versions, a separate, darker persona, the Scarlet Witch, gradually consumes the woman underneath. Now, that doesn't mean Marvel's intentionally sending message that powerful women are dangerous. Not at all. That is not what I'm saying. Many of the writers behind these stories have generally tried to create complexing, meaningful narratives behind the women that they supported and grew up with. Chris Claremont has stated on many occasions that he loved Jean Grey. Brian Michael Bendis has spoken about his deep respect for Wanda, and Mark Waid transformed Susan Storm into a powerhouse that she deserved to be. But individual intent doesn't really erase the structural patterns that can be traced all the way back to the 1960s. And when you lay these stories side by side across the 60 years of publication, the pattern is right there in ink. The Hulk gets a planet, Jean Grey gets a eulogy. Cyclops becomes the face of a revolution, Sue Storm gets a footnote in her psychological strains. These women are not cautionary tales, they are warnings of what can happen when power is unchecked. They are Jean Grey, Sue Storm, and Wanda Maximoff, three of the most powerful, complex, and compelling Marvel characters have ever created. But what do you think? Is Marvel finally starting to write the women the way that they deserve, or is this trope deeply embedded into the DNA of the Marvel Universe? Let me know in the comments below. Be sure to do all those YouTube things, like, share, subscribe. I'm Anderson, and I'm out. Bye.